I'm here with David Berger, who happens to be my brother, but is also a very experienced traveler in his own right. He recently returned from 3 years in Zambia, which provided him a plethora of opportunities to travel all over sub-Saharan Africa on the cheap. And today I've asked him to sit down and talk a little bit about his experiences, some of the countries he saw, what his favorites were, and also to talk a little bit about how to travel safely in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa.
All right, well, good morning. So this morning I'd like to talk to you about a little bit of my experience in Zambia, Malawi, and in Tanzania. I served as a Peace Corps volunteer for 3.25 years, just about. And during that time I had the privilege and the opportunity to take a couple of different vacations. So during that time I traveled to Malawi by bus and by hitchhiking, and I traveled by plane to Tanzania, and then through Dar es Salaam, and then through local ferry to Zanzibar, and then hitchhiking throughout Zanzibar before returning back to Zambia. As a Peace Corps volunteer, I also used a variety of local transportation, including small 12-passenger blue minibuses, back of pickup trucks, large 18-wheelers, personal vehicles, taxis, and quite a variety of transportation methods, whatever was available. So during that time, of course, you pick up a couple of tips about staying safe. One of the most important is to remember that Africa is an extremely diverse continent, and that the country's customs and infrastructure vary widely from country to country. Zambia, Malawi, and Tanzania each have different infrastructure issues. None of them have what I would classify as developed infrastructure, but many of them do have a basic groundwork. Almost everywhere I went, there was the option of what are called luxury buses, which we would equate with Greyhound, or Bolt buses. Some of you may be familiar with Bolt. And these are the big luxury coaches that seat upwards of 50 passengers, versus the smaller miniature buses or mini buses, then private vehicles, taxis, then kind of the rickshaw model of bicycle taxis, down to just large groups getting in the back of a flatbed truck and having the truck take them somewhere. So those were more common with churches or funerals or rural Zambians or Malawians traveling. There are some things that you really need to watch out for that are mostly considered common sense, but that we don't really think of coming from the developed world, because you never think that you'll have to check the tires and make sure that your driver isn't drunk or high on some substance. Unfortunately, the regulation and enforcement of that regulation isn't very good, and so many times you'll find minibus drivers or big luxury bus drivers who have been driving for more than 24 hours and are kept awake by stimulants, or you'll encounter drivers who are underage. Some notorious stories are the conductor and driver passed out and an 8-year-old boy driving the minibus full of people. And you're often reminded during your transit of the consequences of that lack of enforcement in terms of burnt out husks of vehicles, crushed minibuses, sometimes the flipped and twisted wreckage of 18-wheelers and of private vehicles. One that was a constant reminder to me was from my site to Mansa. For a time there was a minibus that had tried to overtake a semi-truck and had hit head-on collision with another semi-truck and had completely been compressed, and all passengers were killed. And that was left on the side of the road for a couple of months as a grim reminder of the precautions that you need to take when choosing your mode of transportation.
So you mentioned that a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but that you would always check the vehicle itself and that you would always check the drivers. what did that entail more specifically? And then how did you deal with situations where you discovered that the drivers weren't in fact fit to drive?
Yeah. Well, so we were introduced to a couple of points by our trainers during our pre-service training. The first is that when you approach a vehicle, you're going to look at the tires themselves. You make sure that they're not bald, that they have tread on them, that they haven't been patched or repaired, that they have sufficient air in them, and that they're all the same size. You might find a minibus that's full of, 15, 20 people that's rated for 12 people, so it's already over capacity, and then they're driving on a donut. So not only do you have a vehicle that's overweight and over capacity, but you have it driving on tires that are absolutely not rated for travel, especially not loaded as such. So the tires are the good first place to start. The next is to check the inside of the driver's window, and this varies from country to country, but the registration and licensing of the vehicle will be present there, and you want to make sure that that's current. There are a lot of illegal taxis, illegal minibuses that don't keep up their registration with the road transit authorities, and you'll find that these are sometimes a little more dangerous. You can also be stranded by this type of transportation because the police will stop them at a checkpoint, and the conductors or drivers might just abandon the vehicle and you and run. And then being a foreigner, you may be expected to pay the fines, or you may get stuck, or you may get a helping hand and they'll help flag down another vehicle for you to transfer into. After you've checked the registration and the tires, you want to kind of listen to the vehicle. Usually they'll be running. If they're not running, that's okay too, but you want to listen to the engine and make sure it sounds like it's firing correctly. So if it's got a knock in it, or if it sounds like it's really struggling, that's going to be an issue. Take a moment to look around the driver's area and look for jugs of water or things that look a little bit out of place. It may have an overheating issue, and again, you can be stranded. So once you've taken a moment to kind of look at the tires, look at the registration, look at the overall condition of the vehicle, you don't really want to get in a bus with pieces falling off of it, or a bus that looks like it's flipped a couple of times. There were some notorious luxury buses that made the run from Kashikishi, which is all the way north in Luapula, down to Lusaka, that had taped their windows back together and had kind of pushed their frame and siding back out because they'd rolled or they'd flipped, and then just kind of been put back together and brought back out onto the road. So those are definitely things to be wary of. Once you've done that, you need to take gauge of the conductor and of the driver. And that usually means being very polite and greeting the driver and saying something nice, but that gives you a lot of information. First, if you get a chance to have a handshake, and in some cultures a handshake isn't appropriate, but if you get within, say, 5 feet from someone, you have a chance to look at their eyes to see if they're bloodshot or if they've been awake for far too long. You have a chance to possibly smell their breath or to see if they can stand up straight. And you get an idea of their overall mental state. Another point of advice is when traveling in larger vehicles, try and put yourself towards the middle of the carriage. And that's just if you are involved in a collision and the front is collapsed or the rear is destroyed, at least in the middle you have a little bit of padding, so you have a higher survival rate. Now all these are pretty scary things, and I was very fortunate. I was only involved in one bus accident during my time, and that was a small, what would be deemed farm equipment truck failed to brake and smashed into the back of our bus on the trip down to Lusaka. And luckily didn't kill anyone, but injured a few folks in the truck because he had passengers in the bed of his truck who were sent flying, and luckily everyone on the luxury bus was fine. Another thing to be wary of is traveling overnight. A lot of the long-distance bus companies will run night buses. And this is another danger because the roads aren't well marked. You'll find people in the bush have been drinking or walking along the roads because it's the only clear path through the bush. And you'll find that the bus drivers keep up a pretty breakneck pace to try and move as quickly as possible. And so, as you can imagine, that can lead to some issues. Unfortunately, sometimes it's not possible to avoid night buses, and then you kind of just have to go with the reputation of the company and follow your instinct and think about who you're riding with. Now, another option away from public transport and these big bus companies is to rent a vehicle, which can be prohibitively expensive, or to hitchhike. I hitchhiked quite often, and for me it was always a pleasant experience, and it was always significantly safer than the public transportation options that were available to me. I have on multiple occasions passed up minibuses or even luxury buses for some of the reasons that I've discussed, and have instead stood by the side of the road and waved down someone driving in a Land Rover, or someone driving in a Mercedes or a BMW, or some government ministry who was passing by would stop and pick me up. And driving in a well-maintained Land Cruiser or in a Land Rover or someone's BMW is generally safer because the vehicles are maintained. But again, you have to be sure that your driver isn't inebriated or taking some sort of substance. There were a couple of situations that I got into, one of which where I got into a car with a local headman who I knew, and we were driving along, and he pops open a cooler in the front seat and starts drinking cane spirits, which are hard alcohol. And I immediately asked him to pull over, and I said, "Oh, no, this is where I'm going," which was not true, but I wanted to save face. And I said, "No, I'm doing a small workshop here, and then I'm continuing on to Mansa." And so I hopped out of the vehicle and let him continue on his way, and then flagged down the next suitable vehicle that came along, which cost me about 3 hours. But the difference between being alive and being in the car with a drinking and drunk driver, I think, was worth those couple of hours.
And culturally, how do you pass, or what techniques did you use to pass in those situations? I mean, there you used an example, but before you got in the vehicle, here you're asking somebody the favor of traveling with them, and then to say, actually, no, I don't want to go with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, the key is to always be polite, and you have the choice. And of course, they're trying to sell their vehicle to you and trying to make a profit. And so they can be quite aggressive in their sales technique. And that includes grabbing of your hand and pulling you, or grabbing of your gear and trying to put it on the vehicle. And the key is just to be polite but very firm. When you say no, mean no. And if they grab your bag, say politely, "No, thank you," and take it back. And they can be aggressive, and you just need to stand your ground. Usually they will note that you're just not interested, and you can walk away, and they'll be focused on another passenger because they'll see you as a lost investment of time. Sometimes they're a little more persistent, and they will chase you down and follow you for a little while. And despite the tugging or the grabbing of your hands or of the attempted, carrying of your bag, you just say no, and you keep a firm hand on your belongings, and you continue to walk away.
So overall, that's a little intimidating, but overall you'd say that it is still possible to travel within sub-Saharan Africa on the cheap using these methods of transit for travelers?
Absolutely. The incidence of vehicle accidents is quite high. And that just has to do with infrastructure, has to do with the quality of the roads, upkeep of the vehicles themselves, the driver's condition, but it also has to do with just a lot of different cultures coming together, and people who aren't necessarily fit to be driving. So if you keep a head about you and you look around and you take stock of your situation and you choose good vehicles, you really won't encounter that many issues. And it is very possible to travel quite cheaply, or sometimes free if you provide good conversation. Several of my hitches were free, even though I offered to pay, because I was there to talk to in the passenger seat, and I kept the driver awake and I kept him entertained, and that was worth the passenger trip for him. So all in all, I think that travel in sub-Saharan Africa, at least in those countries that I've been in and traveled in, which were Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia, can be quite safe and can be enjoyable and can be very cheap.
Thanks, David.